She came 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, and arrived to find him already in the ground. No husband, no money, no way back. The town of Iron Creek didn't offer Lena Ashcroft sympathy. It offered silence, the kind that follows a woman when people have already decided what she is. She had two choices: disappear quietly or prove every single one of them wrong. This is the story of a woman who chose to stay. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you want to follow Lena's journey all the way to the end, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single part. The stagecoach rolled into Iron Creek on a Tuesday, which Lena Ashcroft would later decide was fitting because nothing good had ever been announced to her on a Tuesday. She'd been traveling for 19 days. 19 days of rattling wooden benches and dust that worked its way into every crease of her clothing, every corner of her mouth. Her back ached in a way that had stopped being sharp and become simply constant, a dull, reliable companion, like the worry she'd carried since boarding the first coach in Cincinnati with a single worn suitcase and a letter folded into her coat pocket. The letter was from a man named Howard Pruitt. He had described himself as a rancher of some standing, 44 years old, steady in his habits, seeking a capable woman to manage a household and serve as a proper companion in the years ahead. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, the penmanship of a man who took small things seriously. He had enclosed a photograph, a broad-shouldered figure standing beside a fence post, squinting into the sun. He was not handsome, but his expression was honest, and that had mattered more to Lena than she'd expected. She had written back. They had exchanged 4 letters over 3 months. The arrangement had been made, and now she pressed her face briefly toward the window as the coach slowed, trying to make out the shape of the town and of her future through the fine grit of red dust that clung to the glass. Iron Creek was not impressive from any angle. It was the kind of town that had arrived at its current state not through ambition, but through stubbornness, through people who'd stopped moving and started building simply because they'd run out of reasons to go farther west. A general store, a livery, a saloon with a crooked sign, a narrow white building with a cross on top that served as the local church. Maybe 3 dozen structures in total, scattered along a main road that was mud in spring and cracked dirt in summer, and both kinds of miserable at the same time in between. Lena pulled back from the window and straightened her hat. Her best dress was 4 years old, carefully maintained but unmistakably worn. She had darned the cuffs herself twice. She squared her shoulders anyway. She had learned, somewhere in the long, difficult years of her 20s, that posture cost nothing. The coach stopped. The driver called down from above. Other passengers shifted and gathered their belongings, and Lena waited until the aisle cleared before standing, collecting her suitcase from the rack overhead and stepping down into Iron Creek. The sun hit her immediately, flat and indifferent. There was no one waiting. She stood on the dusty platform for what felt like a long time, watching the other passengers disperse, a traveling merchant heading straight for the saloon, a young couple met enthusiastically by family, an older man she'd shared most of the journey with who disappeared without a word toward the livery. The stagecoach driver unhitched a sack of mail and hauled it inside the station. A dog sleeping against the wall of the general store didn't even bother to lift its head. Lena set down her suitcase. She checked the letter again, though she'd memorized it. Howard Pruitt, Iron Creek, arrival. Tuesday the 14th. She had the date right. She had the town right. She went inside the stage station, where a young man with ink-stained fingers was sorting through mail at a scarred wooden desk. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Howard Pruitt. He was meant to collect me today. I'm a guest of his." The young man stopped sorting. He looked up at her and something changed in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular discomfort of someone who has to deliver news they'd rather not. "You're the woman from back east," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lena Ashcroft." "Yes." He put down the envelope he was holding. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm real sorry to tell you this. Mr. Pruitt passed away 11 days ago. Heart gave out. It was sudden. Nobody knew how to reach you to stop the journey. I don't even know if there was an address to write to." Lena stood very still. She heard the words. She processed them in order, each one arriving separately, The way things do when the mind needs time to accept what the ears already know. He's gone, she said. Yes, ma'am. 11 days. Yes, ma'am. She looked down at the letter in her hand. The careful handwriting, the honest squinting eyes in the photograph, the man who'd taken small things seriously. Was there family? She asked. Someone I should speak with. He had a nephew over in Dalhart, came and collected the property and left about a week ago. The ranch has already been signed over. Of course it had. Lena folded the letter back along its worn creases and put it in her coat pocket. She picked up her suitcase. Thank you, she said. I appreciate you telling me directly. She walked back out into the sun. Mas. She had 41 cents. She counted it in the shadow of the stage station, turning the coins over in her palm, which was not something she had imagined doing on the day she arrived to begin her new life. 41 cents and no claim on anything in this town. No acquaintance, no lodging, no return fare. She had checked on the way out, and the coach back east wouldn't run for another 9 days, and the fare was considerably more than 41 cents. She stood there for a moment thinking very clearly, which was what she did when things were bad. Panic was a luxury she'd learned early she couldn't afford. What she needed immediately was a place to sleep that didn't cost money, food of some kind, and some way to earn enough in the next 9 days to get on a coach back to, well, back to where? Cincinnati had no one waiting for her either. Her mother had been gone for 2 years. She had a landlady who'd already rented out her room the week she left. Going back meant starting over in a city where at least she knew the streets, which was something, but not much. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the main road. The first business she tried was the hotel, a narrow 2-story building with a sign reading Iron Creek Hotel. Clean rooms, reasonable rates. The woman at the desk had gray hair pinned severely back and eyes that assessed Lena in approximately 3 seconds. I'm looking for work, Lena said. Cleaning, cooking, anything you need, in exchange for a room and meals. The woman looked at the suitcase, then at the worn cuffs on Lena's dress, then at her face, as though searching for something confirming. You're that mail order woman, she said, from back east. The stage station clerk had evidently been efficient with information. Yes, Howard Pruitt's woman. I was engaged to Mr. Pruitt. He passed before I arrived. The woman folded her hands on the desk. This is a respectable establishment. I'm a respectable person. I'm sure you believe that. She said it kindly enough, which somehow made it worse. I'm fully staffed at the moment. I'm sorry. Lena thanked her and left. She tried the general store next. The owner, a heavy-set man named Carver, who wore his suspenders tight over a striped shirt, listened to her with his arms crossed. You sweep, stack, take inventory? Yes, she said. All of it. He chewed the inside of his cheek. I'd have to ask my wife. She waited. He disappeared into the back and returned 2 minutes later. She says no, sorry. The saloon she tried last because she'd known it would be the last. The man behind the bar was younger than she expected, with a lean, watchful face. I'm not looking for that kind of work, she said immediately, before he could speak. I'm looking for kitchen work, cooking, cleaning, whatever you need in the back. He looked at her for a long moment. You cook? Well enough. He glanced toward the back. I've got a woman comes in for breakfast service. Could use someone for the midday meal. Pays 50 cents a day, and you eat what you cook. I'll take it. You got somewhere to sleep? I'll find somewhere. He reached under the bar and produced a key on a wooden ring. There's a storeroom in the back. Got a cot in there. It's not much. She took the key. Thank you. His name was Dolan. He didn't ask her anything else, which she was grateful for. The storeroom was exactly what it sounded like. A windowless space about the size of a large closet, stacked on 3 sides with crates and barrels. The cot was narrow, and the mattress had seen better decades, but it was horizontal and she was out of the public eye, and that was enough. She washed her face in the bucket of water Dolan pointed her toward, changed into her second dress, her work dress, cotton and plain, and reported to the saloon's small kitchen, which was smoke-darkened and crowded but functional. She made a vegetable soup from what was available in the cold room and a pan of cornbread that came out slightly uneven on one side because the stove ran hot. She served the midday meal to 11 men who sat at the long tables and ate without complaint. Dolan ate a bowl of the soup himself and said it was fine. It was not a triumph, but it was a start. Word traveled the way it always did in small towns. Through the air, it seemed, moving faster than people could logically have carried it. By the second day, Lena understood that Iron Creek knew who she was. She could see it in the way conversations shifted when she walked past the general store to reach the pump behind the building. In the way the two women talking outside the church paused and watched her go, their expressions not hostile exactly, but not warm either, the particular reserve of people who'd decided they didn't need to extend themselves. She heard the phrase used twice that week, applied to her, mail-order woman. It wasn't spoken like an insult, technically, but it was used to explain her, to place her in a category with a clear and slightly pathetic meaning. She was the woman who had come here to sell herself in marriage and ended up with nothing to show for it. She was a cautionary story. She was a woman without a claim on anything. She kept her head down. She cooked, she cleaned, she slept in the storeroom and counted the days. On her fourth morning in Iron Creek, she was carrying water from the pump to the kitchen when she heard two women talking on the porch of the millinery shop across the road. She wasn't meant to hear. They weren't projecting their voices, just talking normally in the morning air, the way people do when they assume they're among themselves. Can't imagine the nerve, honestly. Coming all this way just to attach herself to some poor man? Well, and then arriving and finding him gone, which I do feel sorry about. Do you? I'm not sure I do. It's hardly respectable, the whole arrangement. And now she's working for Dolan, of all places. At least she's working, I suppose. Lena kept walking. She did not increase her pace because increasing her pace would have confirmed she'd heard. She carried the water inside, set it down on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a moment with her hands braced against the edge of the work table, looking at the grain of the wood. She had known it would be like this. She had not been naive. Small towns had always operated this way. Information became currency, and strangers were taxed heavily on arrival. She had told herself, on the long journey west, that she could manage the initial suspicion as long as she worked steadily and kept to herself, that eventually people would simply forget about her. But knowing something in the abstract and hearing it said aloud in the morning air were two different things. She straightened, pulled on her apron, and started the fire. The town's social calendar, such as it was, seemed to revolve around Saturday evenings, when the week's work was done and people gathered along the main road, outside the general store, on the steps of the church, in loose clusters that moved and reformed and moved again. It wasn't a formal event. It was just the natural human tendency to gather when the hard work paused. Lena did not participate in the Saturday gatherings. She watched from the narrow alley between the saloon and the building next to it, which was close enough to feel the warmth of other people's company without being observed, and which she understood was a deeply strange thing to do, but couldn't quite stop herself from. It was on the second Saturday that she first took note of Gideon Mercer. He wasn't the largest man in the gathering, nor the loudest. He stood at the edge of a group of ranch hands from the Callaway spread, 4 or 5 men who had ridden in for the weekend, and he was listening more than talking. He had the look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors, weathered skin, hands that hung easy at his sides, a hat that was old but well kept. He was maybe 30, she guessed, or a bit past. What she noticed first was not his face, but the way he moved when a child ran across the road and nearly went down in a patch of mud. Without a break in the conversation he was half attending to, he stepped sideways and caught the boy by the back of his shirt collar, steadied him, and released him, and then turned back to the conversation as though nothing had happened. The boy ran on without even registering what had occurred. It was a small thing, but Lena had been watching people carefully all her life, because watching carefully was how you learned who a person actually was before they had the chance to perform it for you. She went back inside before anyone noticed her watching. The trouble with the cornbread was that the oven ran hot on the right side, and she hadn't yet learned exactly how much to compensate. She burned the edge of a batch on Thursday and scraped off what she could and served the rest, and one of the men at the table said loudly that it tasted like char. She said she was sorry. "You going to be serving us burned bread all winter?" he asked. He wasn't angry, just the sort of man who speaks his observations as loudly as his opinions, without distinguishing between them. "I'll get the oven figured out," she said. He grunted and went back to eating. What happened after was small and unremarkable, except that Gideon Mercer was sitting at the far end of the same table, and after the man made his remark and Lena went back to the kitchen, Gideon said, without particular emphasis, "Bread's fine, Elmer." She heard it through the pass-through. She wasn't sure if he'd intended her to. It was nothing, barely a sentence. But she'd spent 4 days in a town where no one had said an unnecessary kind thing in her direction, and something in her chest registered the words and held them there quietly, the way you hold something fragile that you're not sure how to put down. She met him properly 5 days later at the pump. She was hauling water in the early morning before the day's work began, 2 buckets, which was more than 1 trip required, but she'd found that making 1 trip in the morning and 1 in the afternoon was more efficient than multiple small ones. She was concentrating on keeping the buckets level and not sloshing water onto her boots. "Here!" She looked up. Gideon Mercer was standing a few feet away, his own water task apparently finished, and he was reaching for the handle of one of her buckets. She pulled back instinctively. "I have it." "I can see that." He didn't reach further, he just held his hand out in an open, offering way and waited. Just offering. She looked at him for a moment. Why? He seemed to consider this as a genuine question. "Because you're carrying 2 heavy buckets and I'm walking back the same direction, and it seems like a waste not to." It was such a practical answer that she didn't have a reasonable objection to it. She handed him one of the buckets. They walked in silence for a moment. "You're Lena Ashcroft," he said. Not as an accusation, more like checking a fact. "Yes. Gideon Mercer. I work the Callaway spread." "I know. I've seen you at the tables." He nodded. Another few steps, then, "How are you finding the oven?" She glanced at him sideways. "You heard that." "Hard not to." "I'm working on it," she said, a little stiffly. "It runs hot on the right side." "You can stuff a small piece of green wood in the lower air vent on the right. Slows the draw, compensates for the imbalance." She looked at him again, this time with more attention. "That actually works?" "On that kind of stove, yes. If you pack it too tight, it'll smother the fire, so just a small piece." She said nothing for a moment. "I'll try that." "Good." They reached the saloon's back door, and he handed back her bucket. He had good manners, not performed, just functional, the kind that come from having been taught young, and not having thought much about them since. "Thank you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning." And he walked on. Bachab. She tried the green wood trick that afternoon. It worked exactly as he'd described. She stood there in front of that stove for a moment, looking at the even heat now spreading across the surface, thinking about a man who noticed things quietly and offered information plainly and didn't want anything in return for either. Iron Creek did not have many such people, in her experience. But then she hadn't been there very long. He came back to the saloon for the midday meal the next week, and the week after that. He ate quietly, didn't make noise about anything on the table, and occasionally, not every time, but occasionally, said something brief and useful. Once it was that the soup needed more time to reduce. Once it was that she'd gotten the bread right. He said this last thing on a day when she was tired and her back hurt, and she had just found a mouse in the flour bin and had to throw out half the morning's work and start again. And she was not in any state to receive small compliments gracefully. But she heard it, and she noted it. She began to understand that Gideon Mercer was the kind of man who said things because they were true, not because they were easy. This was unusual enough that she paid attention. He did not ask her anything personal. He did not ask about her circumstances or her plans or what she intended to do when the 9 days became indefinite, because she still didn't have enough fare, and going back east still meant going back to nothing. He didn't treat her with the cautious distance the rest of town maintained. That careful politeness that was really just a more sophisticated form of rejection, but he also didn't overcorrect into nosy warmth. He simply talked to her as though she were a person who existed and had things worth saying, which, she was startled to realize, was all she had wanted. On a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks into her time in Iron Creek, she was sweeping the back step of the saloon when he rode by on a bay horse and stopped. "You still working for Dolan?" he asked. "Yes." "You doing anything else?" He said it carefully, like he'd thought about the question before asking it. Anything else? I was talking to Hal Calloway yesterday. His wife has been doing the mending for the ranch hands, but her eyes have been giving her trouble. He's looking for someone to take it on. Pays reasonable. Lena stopped sweeping. You spoke to your employer about me. I mentioned there might be someone looking for extra work, that's all. He didn't seem to think this was a remarkable thing to have done. You'd have to talk to him yourself. She thought for a moment. When? Whenever suits you. I could let him know you'd be coming. Tomorrow afternoon, after the midday service. He nodded. I'll tell him. He rode on. She stood with the broom in her hand and realized she was looking at the space where he'd been. The map. Calloway Ranch was a 4-mile ride from town, which she made on a borrowed horse that was old and slow and extremely opinionated about the pace. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected. A main house with a long porch, 2 barns, a series of paddocks and outbuildings. The kind of place that said people had been working hard here for a long time. Hal Calloway was a big man, broad-shouldered and practical-spoken, with a handshake that was more squeeze than ceremony. His wife Clara was small and sharp-eyed and looked at Lena for a long moment before speaking. You sew? She asked. I do. Repairs, alterations, basic construction. I can cut a pattern. Show me your hands. It wasn't a rude request. She said it matter-of-factly, as someone who'd been evaluating workers for years. Lena held out her hands. The calluses were on the inside joints of her right fingers, where the needle bore, and on the heel of her palm. Clara looked at them and nodded once. The mending's not interesting work, she said. It's shirts with torn collars and trousers with blown seams, and occasionally something more complicated. I used to do it myself, but my eyes... She shook her head. The pay is fair. That's fine, Lena said. I don't need interesting. I need work. Clara looked at her a beat longer than necessary. Sit down, she said. I'll get some coffee. The afternoon turned into something Lena hadn't expected. A long conversation about practical things, thread gauges and fabric weights, and how you pack a needle case for travel, and the particular stubbornness of denim when you're trying to make a clean seam. Clara Calloway had the directness of a woman who'd built something real and didn't have patience for pretense. She didn't ask about the arrangement with Howard Pruitt. She didn't ask about the gossip. She just talked about work, and after an hour she offered Lena the mending contract and they shook hands on it. On the way out, Lena passed Gideon in the yard. He was working on something with a fence post, not looking up. How'd it go, eh? He asked, without looking up. She hired me. He nodded. Good. Thank you, she said. You didn't have to do that. He did look up then. I know. He held her gaze for a moment, direct and uncomplicated. You were working hard and keeping to yourself. Seemed like someone ought to help the situation along. She started to say something. What exactly, she wasn't sure, and then the words didn't arrange themselves correctly, so she just nodded and went to get her borrowed horse. She rode back to Iron Creek in the late afternoon light, the slow old horse moving at its own unhurried speed, and she thought about what he'd said. Seemed like someone ought to help the situation along. Not pity, not charity, just the plain observation that a situation could be helped and that someone with the means to help it ought to do so. She had not expected to find a person like that in Iron Creek. She had not expected to find much of anything in Iron Creek except a husband who was already dead. But the sky was wide open and the grass was red gold in the late light, and she had 2 sources of income now and a place to sleep and a woman who'd shaken her hand like she meant it. It wasn't the life she'd come west to find. It was something else entirely, smaller, harder, uncertain, and oddly hers. The horse plodded on. Lena held the reins and looked at the road ahead and decided, without ceremony, that she would stay. Not because she had nowhere to go. She'd had nowhere to go before and had still found ways to leave. She would stay because the road ahead was unknown, and she had spent enough years retreating from unknown roads, and because a man in a work-worn hat had told her about green wood and hot stoves without wanting anything in return, and because sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to leave. She rode back into Iron Creek as the last of the light went out of the sky, tied the old horse at the livery, and went to start the evening work. She had things to do. She had work waiting. She had 41 cents and a storeroom and a mending contract, and one person in this whole town who had spoken to her like she was worth speaking to. For now, that was enough. The mending work came in a flour sack. Clara Calloway had sent it with one of the ranch hands on Friday morning, a canvas sack stuffed with 11 shirts, 4 pairs of trousers, 2 vests, and a note written in the same direct hand as the woman herself. Collar on the blue shirt is nearly off. The denim trousers need a new waistband entirely. Take your time, but not too much of it. There was no signature. Clara Calloway was not a woman who felt she needed one. Lena cleared a corner of the storeroom, moving a crate of empty bottles and a stack of old ledgers, and set up what passed for a sewing space, a crate for a table, a candle set in a tin for light, her needle case open on the lid beside her. She'd brought her own thread from Cincinnati, a habit of preparedness that now struck her as quietly prophetic. She worked until Dolan knocked on the door and told her the kitchen needed starting. The arrangement had settled into something resembling routine, which she was grateful for. Routine was a kind of anchor. You didn't have to think about the next hour if the next hour was already decided by the work in front of you. Dolan was a fair employer in the blunt, uncomplicated way of a man who didn't have time or temperament for games. He said what he wanted, paid what he'd promised, and left her alone in the kitchen to figure things out, which suited her. He'd stopped directing her after the first week, once it became clear she knew what she was doing. Occasionally he'd taste something from the pot and grunt in a way that could be interpreted as approval. "The soup yesterday," he said one morning, leaning against the kitchen door frame with his coffee. "Men asked for it again today." "I can do that." "What was different about it?" "I found some dried herbs in the back of your cold room. Thyme, I think. I added them at the end." He looked at her for a moment. "Keep doing that." It was not an effusive compliment. She accepted it accordingly. The gossip had not quieted. If anything, it had organized itself, moved from the loose, scattered whispers of the first week into something more structured, the way rumors do when they've been circulating long enough to develop a kind of social consensus. People had decided what Lena Ashcroft was, and they had agreed on it among themselves, and now the agreement had its own weight. She was, depending on who was talking, any combination of the following: a schemer who'd come west looking for a wealthy husband and planned to find another one now that the first had inconveniently died. A woman of uncertain virtue who was working in a saloon for obvious reasons. A charity case who should probably be pitied but probably shouldn't be trusted. Or simply an outsider who hadn't earned her place and was taking up space that rightfully belonged to people who had. None of these things were true. But truth, Lena had learned long before Iron Creek, moved slower than story. What bothered her wasn't the gossip itself. She'd grown up poor enough that people had made assumptions about her family all her life, and she'd developed a certain kind of thick-skinned distance from other people's opinions out of necessity. What bothered her was the particular texture of isolation it created, the way it meant that whenever she stepped out of the saloon to go to the pump or walked to the Calloway Ranch on her working afternoons, she was always moving through a social atmosphere that had already decided to be slightly cold. Not hostile, just closed. Small towns had doors, she was learning. Most of them were shut to her. She might have managed this indefinitely on her own terms. Head down, work steady, count the savings slowly accumulating in the tin she kept under the cot. She was not, at her core, someone who required much in the way of human warmth to function. She'd gone long stretches without it before. What she had not anticipated was Gideon Mercer. He had taken to riding past the saloon on Wednesdays, which were his half-day at the ranch. She didn't know the pattern consciously until she noticed, on the third Wednesday in a row, that she'd started watching the road at around the same time of the afternoon without quite realizing it. He didn't always stop. Sometimes he just slowed the bay horse to a walk and touched the brim of his hat if she was visible and rode on. But often enough he stopped, and they talked. Standing in the dust of the main road with the sun at varying angles depending on the season, which was shifting now from the flat heat of late summer toward something with more edge to it, a coolness in the morning air that came earlier each day. The conversations were practical. They talked about the ranch, about horses, about the mending work. He told her about an abscess one of the Calloway mares had developed in her hoof and what they'd done about it. She told him about a particularly complicated collar repair that had required her to reconstruct the underlying seam structure entirely. They talked about the winter coming and what she ought to get for the storeroom if she was going to stay past the cold months. One Wednesday, he brought her a pound of dried beans and a wedge of salt pork he said were left over from a supply order. She looked at the food and then at him. I didn't ask for that, she said. I know. He set it down on the step beside her. Winter coming, salt pork keeps. You should have things in that room that aren't dependent on Dolan's kitchen running. Gideon. She said his name carefully, like she was testing the weight of it. I can provide my own provisions. I know that too. He met her eyes directly. I'm not suggesting you can't. I'm just saying winter comes fast out here and you've been busy learning a lot of other things, and it's a pound of beans and some salt pork, not a proposition. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to decide she believed that, and then she said, Thank you. Welcome. She picked up the beans. You want the salt pork back if I tell you I already have some? He almost smiled. Almost. Do you? No. Then we're both fine. She was not naive about what was happening. She was 27 years old and had spent her adult life in the company of enough people to know the difference between a man being decent and a man being interested. And she understood that Gideon Mercer was possibly both simultaneously, which was not a complication she'd been expecting when she arrived in Iron Creek with 41 cents and a dead man's letter. She did not allow herself to think about it too directly. She'd come west to make a practical arrangement, and the practical arrangement had collapsed before she'd even unpacked her suitcase. And allowing herself now to think about another man and what his intentions might or might not be felt like exactly the kind of mistake a woman in her position was most vulnerable to making. She had seen, in Cincinnati, what happened to women who let hope substitute for judgment. She had seen what happened when warmth from one source felt like warmth from the world. So she was careful. She accepted the practical help, the oven trick, the connection to Clara Calloway, the salt pork, and she held the rest at a slight remove. She was friendly. She was not encouraging. She was not entirely sure this strategy was working. The town, for its part, noticed. She first understood this on a Saturday morning when she was at the general store. Carver had finally agreed to let her sweep out on Saturday mornings in exchange for a small amount, which she'd accepted because every small amount mattered. And two women came in while she was working on the far side of the room behind a rack of hanging fabrics and did not realize she was there. Saw her talking to Gideon Mercer again yesterday, the first woman said. She had a voice like she'd gargled with vinegar. Standing right there on the main road, playing as you please. I heard that too, the second woman said. She was softer, but not much. Well, it doesn't surprise me. She's been looking for a replacement since she got here. Poor Howard's barely cold and she's already… That's a bit harsh, Margaret. Is it? She came out here as a mail-order bride. The man she ordered died. She needs another arrangement, and Gideon Mercer is a steady man with prospects. You don't think she's calculated that? There was a pause, then, he's too decent to see it coming. That's what I mean. Someone ought to warn him. Lena stood behind the fabric rack and pressed the broom handle with both hands and said nothing. Her heart was beating harder than she liked. Not from embarrassment, from anger, actually, which was a cleaner feeling, one she'd rather have. It was easier to be angry than ashamed. She waited until the women had completed their purchases and left. Then she went back to sweeping. When she saw Gideon on Wednesday, she almost said nothing about it. She went back and forth for the first 15 minutes of their conversation. They were talking about whether she'd gotten the stove's hotspot fully under control, which she had, mostly, and then she stopped herself mid-sentence. Someone's going to warn you about me, she said. He looked at her. Is that right? I heard two women in the general store talking. They think I have designs on you, that I'm looking for a replacement arrangement. She said it plainly, because the alternative was to dress it up in something softer, and the dressing up felt dishonest. I thought you should know what people are saying, so you're not caught off guard by it. He was quiet for a moment. His expression hadn't changed in any dramatic way, but she'd spent enough time studying his face by now to recognize the slight shift that meant he was thinking seriously. They say that directly to me, he said. I'll tell them it's not their business. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. He looked at her steadily. You're telling me so I have the option to put some distance between us, so I can protect my reputation. She said nothing. And I'm telling you that I've heard what people say about you, and I've watched how you work, and those two things don't match up. So I'm not interested in putting distance between us based on what Margaret Holt thinks about your intentions. She absorbed this. How did you know it was Margaret Holt? Because Margaret Holt has thoughts about everybody's intentions. He said it without venom, just fact. Her opinion is not evidence of anything. Lena looked at him for a moment. Most men in your position would take the easier path. Probably. He shrugged, the minimal kind. I'm not most men, I suppose. She believed him. That was the problem. She believed him completely, which was exactly what she'd been trying not to do. October came in gray and cold, and with it a new pressure on Lena's carefully maintained equilibrium. The mending work from the Calloway ranch had increased. Clara had extended the contract to include the household linens, which was more volume but also steadier income. And she'd started, at Clara's quiet suggestion, taking in mending from 2 other families in town who'd heard through channels she couldn't trace that the work was good. This meant money. Not a flood of it, but a trickle that had become a small, reliable stream. She'd stopped counting days since she'd arrived and started counting weeks. And then she'd stopped counting those too, because somewhere in the middle of October she'd had to admit to herself that the question of when she was leaving had shifted into something less urgent, and then into something she was no longer actively thinking about. She was, for better or worse, staying in Iron Creek. She moved out of Dolan's storeroom in the second week of October into a single room above the land office on the south end of Main Road. The room was small and cold and had a window that faced east, so the morning light came in early and bright, which she liked. She bought a blanket and a better candle holder and a small rug that had seen better days but was still functional. She arranged her needle case on the sill of the window, where the light hit it in the afternoon. She told Dolan she'd still work the kitchen through the lunch service. He said fine. She suspected he'd been slightly worried she would leave. Not from any sentiment, but because he'd have to find someone else. And finding someone else was trouble. Clara Calloway, when she came into town that week for supplies, looked at Lena with those sharp eyes and said, "You got a room. Above the land office." "Good." She nodded once. "You were in that storeroom too long." It served its purpose. Most things do. Clara picked up a bolt of fabric and squinted at it. "You eat enough?" "You look thin." "I eat fine." "Come to the ranch Sunday. I'll send Gideon in to let you know the time." She said it as though it were simply logistics, which it mostly was, but Lena noted the name and said nothing about it. The Sunday dinner at Calloway Ranch was not a small affair. She'd expected something quiet, Clara and Hal and perhaps a few ranch hands, and found instead a long table in the main room laid for 14 people, including 3 families from properties near the ranch, the Calloway's daughter visiting from the next county, and at the far end of the table, Gideon Mercer, who looked at Lena when she arrived with exactly the same expression he always had, which was to say, steady and direct. Hal Calloway shook her hand and told her to sit where she liked. His daughter, a practical young woman named Ruth, who had her mother's eyes, talked to Lena for most of the meal about fabric sourcing, which was genuinely interesting. The families from the neighboring properties were polite enough. Some of them she recognized from town, and she could see them recalibrating slightly in the face of her presence at a table they respected. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but it was a reduction in the cold. At the end of the meal, when people were standing and the conversation had broken into smaller groups, Gideon appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee. "How's the room?" he asked. "Cold, but it's mine." She accepted the coffee. "Why did Clara invite me?" "She likes you." "Clara doesn't seem like someone who does things out of sentiment." "She doesn't." He looked at her sideways. "She thinks you're capable, and she thinks people in this town have been stupid about you. She has opinions about stupidity." Lena looked at the room, the families she half recognized, the Calloway daughter talking with her father, the long table with its remains of the meal. "And you?" she asked. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think you work harder than you have to, and you ask for less than you deserve," he said. "And I think you've been doing both of those things for a long time, not just since you arrived here." She turned and looked at him directly. "That's an observation about a person you've known for 2 months." "I know." He held the look. "Doesn't make it wrong." She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't cost her something, and she hadn't decided yet whether she was ready to pay it. She finished her coffee and said goodnight to the Calloways and rode back to Iron Creek in the cold dark, the east-facing window of her room waiting at the end of the road. So, 2 weeks after the Sunday dinner, she was at the pump in the early morning, a habit she hadn't broken even from the storeroom days because the mornings were hers and she'd come to protect them. When Margaret Holt appeared, she had not spoken directly to Lena before. The general store conversations had been with the false privacy of a woman who believed herself unobserved. This was different. Margaret Holt standing 4 feet away in the morning gray, her coat buttoned to the chin, her mouth set. "I want to speak plainly," Margaret said. Lena finished drawing the water. "All right. Gideon Mercer is a good man. He's respected here. He's been part of this community his whole life, and his reputation matters." "I agree with all of that." Margaret seemed slightly wrong-footed by the agreement. "What you're doing, what am I doing, exactly?" Lena asked. She kept her voice even. She was not going to be angry in public, which was something she'd decided some time ago and was now enforcing. "Tell me specifically." Margaret stopped. "You came here as a mail-order bride. That's a known fact." "Yes." "And now you're spending time with a man this community knows and trusts." "I spend time with several people in this community. Clara Calloway, Hal, your neighbor Ruth Prentice, whose mending I've been doing for 3 weeks. Are you concerned about those associations as well?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "It's not the same." "No," Lena agreed. "It's not, because those associations don't threaten anything you're trying to protect." She picked up her water bucket. "If you have a concern about Gideon Mercer's well-being, I suggest you talk to Gideon Mercer. He's capable of making his own decisions, and I think he'd tell you so." She walked back toward her room. She wasn't certain her hands were steady. She gripped the bucket handle and kept her pace even and did not look back. And when she got inside and set the water down on the small table by the window, she stood there for a moment and breathed. She had meant every word. She had not enjoyed saying them. The problem with standing her ground was that it cost something every time, even when you were right, especially when you were right. Because being right didn't fix the whispers, didn't open the closed doors, didn't make Margaret Holt into a different kind of person. It just meant that Lena had done what her conscience required, and now had to go on living in the same town as the consequences. She made herself some coffee and sat by the east window and watched the morning light come in and tried to decide what she thought about all of it. What she thought was this: she had stayed in Iron Creek because she'd decided she was done retreating. And a woman who'd decided she was done retreating couldn't also decide that she was going to retreat from the one person in this town who treated her like she was worth standing beside. She thought about what he'd said. "I think you work harder than you have to, and you ask for less than you deserve." She thought about the fact that he'd said it without wanting anything in return for it. The same way he'd told her about the green wood and the hot stove. The same way he'd carried her water bucket that first morning. Not as currency, just as the plain truth that he thought she ought to know. She finished her coffee. She had a shirt to repair and a midday service to cook for, and she would do both of those things, and the whispers would continue, and Margaret Holt would continue to have opinions, and Gideon Mercer would continue to be himself, and she would continue to be herself, which was a woman who'd come 1,000 miles and found nothing she'd expected, but was beginning, against considerable odds and her own careful resistance, to find something she hadn't known to look for. Outside, the light went from gray to pale gold. Iron Creek went about its morning. Lena picked up her needle and went to work. The smell of smoke reached Iron Creek before anyone saw the flames. It came in on the wind from the northwest, a thin, acrid thread that worked its way into the evening air and made people stop and lift their heads without quite knowing why, the way animals do when something has changed in the atmosphere and the body knows it before the mind catches up. It was a Saturday night, the weekly gathering still loosely assembled along the main road, and the first person to say anything was a boy of about 12 who pointed toward the ridge above the Calloway Valley and said, loud and flat, "Something's burning." Then everyone saw it. The sky above the ridge had gone the wrong color. Not the deep blue-gray of a November night, but something orange underneath, a bruised and pulsing glow that moved like a living thing. Someone said the word barn. Someone else said no, it's too big for a barn. And then the wind shifted and the smell thickened and the orange behind the ridge climbed higher. And Lena understood before anyone said it plainly that whatever was burning was large and it was not stopping. The Calloway Ranch. She knew it the way you know certain things. Without ceremony, without logic, just the immediate convergence of direction and wind and the particular shade of that ugly orange light over ground she'd ridden across a dozen times now. She was already moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The road to the ranch was 4 miles, and she covered the first 2 at a run before she remembered she had no horse. Her borrowed horse from the early visits had long since returned to the livery, and she'd never had occasion to keep one because the walk to the ranch in daylight had always been manageable. She'd left her room and come out to the main road and started north without thinking. And now she was in the dark of the road with the orange glow thickening ahead and her breath coming hard and no horse and no plan. A wagon came up behind her. She stepped aside and the driver, a man she recognized from the general store, pulled the horses up. "Get in," he said. "Anyone on foot's not going to make any difference." She climbed into the back. 2 other men were already there. She couldn't see their faces in the dark. The wagon moved faster than her legs would have carried her, jolting over the ruts of the road, and the glow ahead got bigger and wrong-colored, and she gripped the side of the wagon and didn't let herself think about anything specific. The ranch came into view around the bend in the road, and what she saw made her stomach drop. The large barn, the main horse barn, the one she'd walked past a dozen times, the one that held 12 horses at capacity, was entirely involved. The fire had taken the south wall and the roof and was working on everything else with mechanical efficiency, the way fire does when it's been left alone long enough to organize itself. The heat was visible from 50 yards away, a distortion in the air. The sound was enormous, a continuous roaring conversation between fire and wood and wind, punctuated by things cracking and falling inside that made several people flinch without realizing they'd done it. People were already there, ranch hands, neighbors from the nearest property, Hal Calloway standing near the main house with a look on his face that was beyond expression. Clara was beside him, one hand on his arm, watching the barn with the tight stillness of a woman who has already done everything she can do and knows it. Someone had gotten the horses from the smaller outbuildings. They were in the paddock fence at the far south end of the property, nervous and shifting, their breath coming in clouds. But from the main barn there was no sound of horses, and the sound of that absence was louder than the fire. "How many still inside?" someone called. A ranch hand named Pruitt said 4, maybe 5. "The back stalls. The door on the east side came down and we couldn't—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. Someone said, "Nobody can go in there." And then Gideon Mercer came around from the east side of the barn at a run, his coat off, his shirt dark with sweat and ash, and Lena saw him and understood in the same instant that he had already been inside at least once. She could see it in the way he moved, slightly off balance, squinting in the way of a person whose eyes are bothered by smoke. He stopped and assessed the east side of the barn, which was lower than the roof and still structurally intact, and then he looked at the handful of men standing there and said, "The east door's down, but the window is still open. If someone gets me a rope and blankets—" "Gideon," Hal Calloway said. His voice was different from any way she'd heard it before. Stripped down, raw. "It's too far gone." "The back stalls are stone on 2 sides," Gideon said. He was already moving toward the equipment that had been dragged out of the other building. "The fire's still on the roof in the front. Those horses might still be—" "It's not worth your life." Gideon looked at him. "Get me a rope," he said, and went to find one himself. Lena had come off the wagon and moved through the loose crowd without purpose. She had no specific task, no role here. She was simply one of the people drawn to witness something terrible. And she found herself standing near Clara Calloway, who was watching her husband watch Gideon pull a rope from the equipment pile with the focused attention of a man who has stopped listening to arguments. "He's going in again," Clara said, not alarmed, just stating it. "Can anyone stop him?" Lena asked. "Not when he gets like this." Clara said it without any particular inflection. "He's been that way since he was young. Hal says it's not stubbornness. It's just that he calculates differently than other people. He doesn't discount his own life the way most men do when it's in the ledger." Lena watched Gideon wet the blanket in the water trough. A ranch hand had finally come forward to help, holding the rope and wrap it around his shoulders. The fire crackled and sent a shower of embers into the air, and 6 people stepped back. Gideon didn't step back. He went through the east window. The next several minutes were the kind that stretch, the kind where time stops correlating with anything rational and instead becomes purely experiential, measured in heartbeats and breaths and the unbearable silence between sounds. People stood and watched the window. The fire continued on the front side of the barn, talking to itself in its loud, indifferent language. Inside, nothing visible, just smoke and orange light from the wrong direction. Then a horse screamed. Not the scream of a horse already in pain, the scream of a horse that has been touched by something in the dark and startled. A living sound. People near the east side scrambled to position themselves near the window, reaching forward with their arms. A rope appeared in the window frame. Then the head of a horse, wild-eyed and terrified, being pushed from behind by hands that didn't appear yet. The men grabbed the halter and pulled, and the horse came through with a tremendous noise and reared, and someone held the lead rope and someone else ran it toward the paddock, and the horse went, and then the window again, and rope, and a second horse, and then a third. The fourth horse, a young mare Lena had seen in the yard before, came through the window sideways and nearly took out the man holding the frame. And then Gideon appeared. He came through head first and rolled onto the ground outside, and someone grabbed his arm and pulled him upright, and he coughed and bent double and coughed again, and then one of the men said something and pointed. And there was a sound from the barn that was nothing like anything else. A deep, structural groan, the kind that a building makes right before it stops being a building. And a section of the east wall came down in a cascade of fire and timber that hit the ground 8 feet from where Gideon was still bent double, trying to get air into his lungs. Nobody moved for a second. Then everyone moved. Also, Lena moved with them. She moved toward him, which she only noticed after the fact, the way you notice the direction of your own feet when you look down and realize you've been walking without watching where you went. He was sitting on the ground by then. The man who'd pulled him up was talking to him, and he was waving the man off with one hand, the way someone does when they're all right but need a moment to prove it. His face was dark with soot, and his shirt had a burn along one forearm that she could see from 10 feet away. Not deep, she told herself, looking at it. Not deep. Just the surface caught by heat or ember. He was blinking hard against the smoke irritation. She stopped a few feet from him, and he looked up. "Are you—" she started. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was rough, scraped out. "Your arm." He looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "It's not bad." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her again, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, but something that had been held at a managed distance and was now slightly less managed. He looked tired. Not the tired of a hard day's work, but the kind that comes from having been frightened and having moved through it, and now being on the other side where your body starts sending you the invoice. "I'm all right," he said, more quietly. She sat down in the dirt beside him. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't plan it. She just folded herself down onto the ground next to him because he was sitting there and she was there, and it seemed like the right thing. Around them, the scene continued. The fire doing its patient work, men throwing water where they could reach. Hal Calloway talking to someone in a low voice. Clara organizing what needed to be organized because Clara always organized what needed to be organized. 4 horses safe in the paddock. The 5th, the ranch hand Pruitt had told her, they hadn't gotten to in time. They sat in the dirt and watched the barn burn, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything for a little while. That was not a calculation other people would have made, she said finally. He thought about this. 4 horses. 4 horses and your life in the same equation. Horses are expensive. He said it without quite meaning it to be funny, and she didn't quite laugh, but it released something in the atmosphere between them. "Gideon." She said his name and then didn't say anything else for a moment. "When you went back in the second time, I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know if you were coming back out." He turned and looked at her. His face was close and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. The smoke and effort had stripped away the habitual steadiness and left something more unfinished underneath, which, perversely, she found easier to look at. "I came back out," he said. "I know. I usually do. That is not particularly comforting." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why did you come up here?" he asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely curious, the way he always was, interested in the actual answer. She'd been asking herself the same question on the wagon, and she had a partial answer. "I saw the smoke," she said, "and I knew it was the Calloway Ranch, and I—" She stopped. The honest version was harder than the edited version. She chose the honest version. "I knew you were here." He held that answer quietly for a moment, looking at her. Lena, he said. Don't. She cut herself off. She'd been about to say don't read something into it, or I just wanted to make sure everyone was all right, which were both partially true and mostly a retreat, and she was tired of retreating. I knew you were here, she said again, and I needed to know you were all right. That's what it was. He nodded once, slowly. His eyes were very direct, the way they always were, but they had something in them now that wasn't there in their Wednesday conversations or the Sunday dinner table, something raw and paying attention. All right, he said. Just those two words. She helped Clara clean the burn on his arm with water and a cloth from the house, and then the Calloways pressed everyone to come inside, at least briefly, at least for coffee before the long ride back, and the remaining crowd sorted itself into those who stayed and those who headed home. Most stayed. The fire had burned itself to a sullen, hissing remnant by then, and men were throwing the last of the water on the timbers, and the crisis had settled into its aftermath, the particular flat exhaustion that follows disaster, when your body remembers that it was frightened and presents the bill. Inside the main house, Clara moved through the room with a kind of focused practicality that Lena had come to recognize as her version of care, making sure people had something warm, directing the logistics, not letting anyone wallow in the shock of what had happened when there were still things that could be done. She put Lena to work making coffee, which Lena did, and the familiarity of the task was steadying. Gideon sat at the long table with his arm cleaned and wrapped with a strip of cloth and his coffee in front of him, and two of the ranch hands were talking to him about what had happened, practical, technical things, what they might have done differently, where the fire had started, and he was answering in his usual low, careful way. Then Vernon Hatch came in. She'd seen Hatch around town. He was one of the louder presences in Iron Creek, a man in his mid-40s who had land and a certain amount of standing and the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in his own estimation. He came in with two other men from the neighboring property and stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the gathered group, and then looked specifically at Lena, who was behind the kitchen counter with Clara's coffee pot. "What's she doing here?" he asked. Not quietly. The room noticed. Rooms always notice when something shifts. Clara turned from the hearth. "She's making coffee, Vernon. Would you like some?" "I mean, what's she doing at the ranch?" "She came up when she saw the smoke, same as you did." "It's not the same." He looked at Gideon. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Gideon said. His voice hadn't changed. "Good." Hatch moved further into the room. He was the kind of man who took up space deliberately. "Because I heard you went in 4 times for those horses. That's a brave thing. You're a man this community relies on, and I want to make sure people understand that." He looked at the room generally, the way a man does when he's making a point and needs witnesses. Brave men deserve respect. They deserve to have people around them who are worthy of that respect. It was elaborate enough that everyone in the room understood what it was doing. The silence that followed was the silence of people waiting to see what would happen next. Gideon put down his coffee cup. He looked at Hatch with an expression that was perfectly level and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You done?" Hatch blinked. "I'm just saying. I heard what you were saying." His voice was still even, but the evenness had an edge in it now. Not loud, not threatening, but the edge of a man who has decided to stop letting something pass. "You're using a question about my health to make a comment about Lena. I'd prefer you didn't." "I didn't say her name." "No, you didn't. That's usually how it works." He looked at Hatch steadily. "She came up here tonight because she was worried. She came up in the dark on a wagon with no particular obligation to anybody on this property, and she helped where she could help, same as everyone else in this room. Now you're standing in Hal Calloway's house suggesting she doesn't deserve to be here. And I'm asking you to stop." "Gideon, she's been in this town 3 months, and she's worked every day of those 3 months, and she's done right by everyone who's given her a chance. What she did before she came here and what happened when she arrived is not her fault, and it's not your business. And I'm done listening to people use it as a reason to treat her like she doesn't matter." He said it steadily. Not with heat, with something quieter and harder than heat. The room was very still. Hatch had the face of a man who had not anticipated this version of Gideon Mercer and was recalculating. "I've got nothing against the woman personally." "Good," Gideon said. Then you won't have any trouble treating her like you'd treat anyone else who came to help on a bad night." He picked up his coffee cup again. Conversation, like water, found its level again after a few seconds. Other people speaking, the fire crackling, someone asking about the horses. Hatch sat down at the other end of the room and said nothing more. Lena stood behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand and looked at Gideon, who was not looking at her, who was listening to a ranch hand explain something about the roof structure of the old barn. His face was the same as always. She set the coffee pot down carefully. Clara appeared beside her and refilled her own cup and said, in a voice pitched only for Lena, "He's had that in him the whole time. He just needed a reason to say it." Lena looked at her. "Don't make that face," Clara said. "I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Ashim." The crowd began to disperse around midnight, when the last of the water had been thrown, and there was nothing left to do that couldn't be done in daylight. People said their goodnights to Hal and Clara, who would have a long week ahead of them, everyone understood, rebuilding and accounting and doing what you do after something is lost, and filed out into the cold. Lena started to follow the group toward the wagons going back to town. She had work in the morning, and a long night had already gotten longer, and she was tired in the particular way of someone who has been frightened and then relieved and then given a chance to feel all of it at once. Gideon fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming. "I'll walk you to the wagon," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." They walked across the yard in the dark. The fire had gone to embers, sending up a thin column of smoke that was visible against the cold sky. Around them the sound of horses and departing wagons and voices calling goodnight. He stopped beside the wagon and she turned to face him. "What you said in there," she began, "I meant it." "I know you did." She looked at him. She was tired enough that the careful management she usually maintained was lowered, and she didn't have the energy to put it back up. "You didn't have to do that. I can manage what people say." "I know you can." He looked at her directly. "I didn't do it because you couldn't manage. I did it because it was wrong, and I was done watching it be wrong." She held that for a moment. "Lena," he said. He said her name the way he always did. Not like a preamble, not leading anywhere, just her name, like he was checking that she was still there. "Yes," she said, which wasn't an answer to a question, but he seemed to understand it anyway. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just closed his fingers around hers in the cold air. His hand was warm and slightly rough, and completely certain. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face. "I've been careful," she said, "about this. I know. I came here to make a practical arrangement, and the arrangement fell apart, and I told myself I wasn't going to—" "I know what you told yourself," he said, quietly. "I've been watching you tell yourself that for 3 months." She almost laughed. She almost did. "You're a complicated woman to wait on," he said, and there was something in his voice that was the closest she'd heard to warmth breaking through the steadiness, like a light under a door. "I'm not complicated," she said. "I'm careful. I know the difference." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to be less careful. I'm asking you to be careful in the same direction as me, that's all." The wagon driver called out that he was heading back. She looked at Gideon one more moment, the cold air, the smoke, the embers behind them, his hand still holding hers. "I need to go," she said. "I know." She stepped up into the wagon. He released her hand. She didn't look back as the wagon pulled away because she knew if she looked back she would see him standing there watching her go with the same expression he always had, steady and direct and patient as anything she'd ever known. And she wasn't sure what she'd do about that yet. So she looked at the road ahead, the dark hills, the cold November sky. She thought about a man going through a burning window because 4 horses were on the other side, and about that same man standing in a firelit room and saying, "I'm done watching it be wrong," in a voice that didn't rise or fall. She thought about hands in cold air. She rode back to Iron Creek in the dark, and the road was long, and the embers of Calloway's barn were still visible above the ridge when she looked back once, just once, at the last bend, before the road turned and took the ridge out of sight. She faced forward again and said nothing, and thought a great deal, and let the wagon carry her home. The burn on his arm healed faster than the talk did. That was the nature of small towns. The physical evidence of a thing disappeared on schedule, while the social evidence of it kept circulating, picking up new details as it went, becoming something slightly different with each retelling until what actually happened and what people said happened were related but no longer identical. By the end of the week following the fire at Callaway Ranch, Iron Creek had processed the event into its collective memory with the particular efficiency of a place where dramatic things happened infrequently enough that when they did, they got worked over thoroughly. What most people agreed on, Gideon Mercer had gone into a burning barn multiple times and saved 4 horses and come out with a burn on his arm and no apparent regret about any of it. That part was told with admiration, sometimes outright pride. The town liked having a man like that in it, liked the reflected character of him, liked being the place where Gideon Mercer lived and did the things he did. What people agreed on less neatly, what had happened after, in the Callaway main house, with Vernon Hatch standing in the doorway and Gideon saying what he'd said about Lena Ashcroft. She heard versions of it. Some were accurate, some were embellished in one direction or another, depending on who was telling them and what they wanted the story to mean. The most common version she overheard was that Gideon had dressed Hatch down in front of the whole room, which wasn't quite right. His voice had never risen, he hadn't dressed anyone down. But she understood that the truth of a social event was less about what happened and more about what people needed it to mean. And what Iron Creek needed this to mean was that something had shifted. The question was what? She kept working. This was not strategy or performance. It was simply what she did. Because the work was there and she was there, and stopping would have changed nothing except that fewer shirts would have gotten mended. Clara Callaway sent the week's mending as usual. Dolan's kitchen needed cooking. The room above the land office needed the windows sealed against the winter cold, which she did herself with strips of cloth and a paste she made from flour and water that was not elegant but was functional. Gideon came on Wednesday. He came on the following Wednesday too. The conversation between them had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and said there, that's the difference, but shifted nonetheless, in the way things do after something has been said that can't be unsaid, and both people know it. He held her hand in the cold for 30 seconds outside the Callaway Ranch, and she had not pulled away, and that was the kind of thing that lived between two people afterward, whether they acknowledged it directly or not. He asked her once how she was sleeping. Fine, she said. Why? You look tired. I'm always tired. I work 2 jobs. He considered this. You could take on less. I could save less, she corrected, which is not the same as an improvement. He accepted this logic without argument, which she appreciated. Some men, when they were beginning to care about a woman, started trying to solve her. Gideon didn't do that. He observed. He offered things when he had something to offer. He didn't try to restructure the life she'd built around his idea of how it should look. What are you saving for? He asked on one of the Wednesdays. Land, eventually. She said it before she'd consciously decided to. I've been thinking about it. There's that parcel on the South Ridge, the one that borders the Prentice property. It's been sitting empty for 2 years. He looked at her. You've been thinking about buying land. Thinking isn't buying, but yes. He was quiet for a moment. You know anything about running land? I know how to learn. He almost smiled. That's probably the most honest answer I've heard to that question. I don't have the money yet. It's still mostly in the thinking stage. She pulled her coat tighter. The December cold had arrived properly now, the kind that made the air feel thinner. Don't say anything about it to anyone. I wouldn't. She knew he wouldn't. That was why she'd told him. The annual social, Iron Creek's most organized collective event, held in the first week of December in the largest room of the town hall, which doubled as a general meeting space, an occasional courtroom, had been a known quantity on the town's calendar for months. People talked about it the way people in small places talk about anything regular and anticipated, with a mix of genuine enthusiasm and the particular low-level anticipation of a social event in a place where social events are finite. Lena had not planned to attend. This was not avoidance exactly. It was more the simple arithmetic of her situation. She had no particular standing in the event, no established group to arrive with, and the prospect of appearing alone at the town's most public gathering and navigating the social landscape of Iron Creek without any cover struck her as an exercise in unnecessary exposure. She'd been doing well at managing her position in the town. She had work, she had a room, she had a small number of people who treated her decently. Risking all of that on a single evening seemed like poor judgment. She'd mentioned this calculation to Clara Calloway, obliquely, when Clara had brought it up during a Thursday afternoon visit to the ranch. "You should go," Clara said. She was turning a hem and not looking up. "I wasn't planning to." "That's why I said you should." Clara bit the thread. "Staying away looks like shame, and you don't have anything to be ashamed of." "I know that." "Then go." Lena picked up the shirt she was working on. "It's not that simple. Most things aren't." "You still do them." Clara glanced up. "Hal and I are going. You can come with us in the wagon if you want to weigh in." She hadn't said yes or no before she left. She'd said she'd think about it, which Clara received with the expression of a woman who knew what thinking about it meant. She was still thinking about it on Monday evening when someone knocked on the door of her room above the land office. She opened the door and Gideon was standing there in the hallway, hat in hand, his coat dusted with the particular cold that comes from a long ride. She'd learned to read the distance a man had ridden by the depth of cold in his jacket. "You rode in tonight," she said. "Had some business to see to." He paused. "Can I come in?" It was an unusual request. The stairway landing was where they'd spoken before when he'd come to her door, which had happened twice, both times briefly. She stepped back and let him in, and he came inside and looked at the room the way people do when they're visiting a space for the first time. The east-facing window, the needle case on the sill, the small rug, the blanket on the cot that she'd folded with the precision of someone who lived in a small space and needed it to stay ordered. "It's a good room," he said. "I think so." She stood near the window. "What's the business?" He held his hat with both hands and looked at her directly. "The social is Friday." "Yes." "I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him for a moment. As the woman I want to walk in with," he said. "That's all. I'm not trying to make a statement. I'm asking you to go with me because I want to go with you." "Gideon." She said his name carefully, the way she always did. "You know what it'll look like." "I know what it'll look like. To some people it'll confirm exactly what they've been saying, that I've been—" "I know what they've been saying." His voice was even. "I've also told you I don't care what they're saying." "You told Vernon Hatch you didn't care," she said. "In a room full of people after a dramatic night, when you had the goodwill of having just saved 4 horses. Friday is different. Friday is ordinary. There's no drama to soften it. It's just you and me walking through the door together, and people deciding what to do with that." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "That's what it is." She understood then that he knew exactly what he was doing, that this wasn't impulsiveness or the afterglow of a dramatic evening. He'd had 2 weeks to think about it, and he was here now, on a Monday night after a long, cold ride, asking her plainly. "I'm not looking to be a statement," she said. "I told you that. I want to be ordinary. I want to be a person here without it being a whole thing every time." "I know," he said, "and the best way to do that is to go to the Friday social like a person who belongs here, because you do." She turned and looked out the east window at the cold dark of the December night. The street below was quiet. A single lamp burned outside the general store. "What time?" she said. "I'll come for you at 7. She looked back at him. He was watching her with that expression she'd come to know. Steady and attending, not pressing, just present. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. "I'll see you Friday then." "You'll see me Wednesday first." Something crossed his face that was close to a smile. "That's true." He left. She listened to his boots on the stairs going down, and then the sound of the downstairs door, and then the quiet again. She stood in her room for a moment in the middle of the floor, looking at nothing in particular. Her heart was doing something unreasonable, which she noted and did not indulge. She had work to do. She had a shirt with a blown seam waiting on the crate table and a Thursday delivery to Clara and a kitchen to open at 6 in the morning. She had ordinary things and she would do them, and on Friday she would put on her better dress, the blue one that was 4 years old but still had its shape, and she would let Gideon Mercer walk through the door of the Iron Creek Town Hall with her, and she would deal with whatever came next in the way she'd been dealing with everything, by standing up straight and doing what needed to be done. She sat down and picked up the shirt and threaded her needle. Wednesday was unremarkable. Thursday brought a light snow that didn't stick. Friday arrived with the particular stillness that a winter evening sometimes carries, the air cold and very clear, the sky deepening toward a dark blue that made the lamplight in windows look warm and close. She put on the blue dress. She'd pressed it Tuesday with a flat iron heated on the stove, working carefully to avoid scorching the older fabric. She did her hair up neatly, the way her mother had shown her, with 2 pins at the back that she'd kept for 6 years because they'd belonged to her mother, and she wasn't going to lose them to a careless moment. She looked at herself in the small square of mirror above the washstand. She looked like herself, not transformed, not polished into something she wasn't, just Lena Ashcroft in her best dress with her mother's hairpins, going somewhere in a small frontier town on a Friday night in December. She thought, that will have to be enough. Gideon knocked at 7 exactly. She had expected him to be prompt, and he was. He had cleaned up. His shirt was pressed, his coat was his good one, his hat was brushed. He was not the kind of man who could be made to look fine-featured or elegant because his face wasn't built for it, but he was clean and deliberate and looked like someone who'd thought about showing up. "You look well," he said. "Thank you." She picked up her coat. "So do you." They walked together through the cold street toward the town hall. It was maybe 5 minutes on foot. He didn't take her arm or make any particular show. He just walked beside her, at her pace, which was how he'd always walked beside her. She could see the light from the town hall windows at the end of the road, warm and yellow. She heard the music before she reached the door. A fiddle and something else. A guitar or a banjo, she couldn't distinguish yet. The sound of voices and movement. The ordinary cheerfulness of people glad to have an occasion. Gideon opened the door. The room inside was large by Iron Creek standards, lit with every lamp the building possessed, plus candles on the tables arranged along the walls. Maybe 60 people, maybe more. She couldn't count quickly. She had a brief impression of color and movement and the smell of wood smoke and baked things, and then the nearest cluster of people registered the open door and turned, and Lena understood in the first 3 seconds exactly what Clara had predicted would happen. The room didn't stop. It wasn't dramatic, but it adjusted. The particular social adjustment of a room that has noticed something, like a ripple moving outward from a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned, conversations flickered. The immediate vicinity went slightly quieter, and the quiet spread in a wave, and then the wave flattened out and the room resumed, but the resumption was self-conscious, everyone deciding individually how to behave. She did not look at the floor. She'd made this decision sometime on Wednesday, and she was keeping it. Gideon moved them inside, a hand at the small of her back that was brief and light, and then gone, just enough to say forward. And she moved forward. Hal Calloway saw them first. He crossed the room with his wife's hand in the crook of his arm and shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Lena and said, "Glad you came," with the particular warmth of a man who means a simple thing and says it simply, and that was the first moment she felt her shoulders actually descend from where they'd been for the last 10 minutes. Clara looked at her dress and said, "That's a good blue," which from Clara Calloway was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Calloways moved them further into the room, which was partly social navigation and partly, Lena suspected, deliberate management by Clara, who understood the architecture of public opinion and knew that the first people to receive someone determined how that receiving looked to everyone watching. Several other people came to speak with Hal and stayed to include Gideon and therefore Lena in the conversation. Neighbors from the valley, a man who ran the land office 2 floors below her room and had always been politely distant with her. He shook her hand this evening and said he understood she'd done good work at the Calloway place the night of the fire. She said she'd just been one of many people there. He said that was true, but she'd been there, and that counted. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't the town voting to reconsider everything it had decided about her in the first week of her arrival. It was one man saying a true thing at a party, and she didn't let it mean more than that. But it meant something. The part she hadn't anticipated was Ruth Prentice. Ruth, the neighbor whose mending Lena had taken on, a practical woman in her 30s who'd known Clara Calloway for years, came over about half an hour into the evening and stood beside Lena while Gideon was occupied talking to one of the ranch hands about the barn reconstruction. "Margaret Holt is going to say something to you tonight," Ruth said. She said it in the same tone she'd used to mention a change in the weather. Lena looked at her. "Is she? She's been building herself up to it since you came in. I know her expressions." Ruth smoothed the front of her skirt. I want you to know that if she does, I'll be standing here. Lena looked at this woman she'd known for 6 weeks, who had shaken her hand at the end of every Thursday mending delivery, and asked about the work with genuine interest, and never once made her feel like the arrangement was charity. "Thank you," she said. "It's not for you especially," Ruth said with the directness she shared with Clara. "I'm tired of Margaret Holt appointing herself the moral authority of this town. It's been going on for years. Tonight seems like a reasonable opportunity to say so." She paused. "But also partly for you." Lena almost laughed. She genuinely almost did. Margaret Holt came at her between the end of the second set of music and the beginning of the third, which was when people were shifting and moving and the noise of the room provided a kind of privacy. She appeared at Lena's side with the expression of a woman who has prepared a speech. "I want you to know," Margaret said, "that I have nothing personal against you." Lena had been here before. That exact preamble 2 months ago at the pump. "You mentioned that. I want to say it again, because I've been thinking about what you said at the pump, and I think you may have misunderstood my concern." "Tell me what your concern is then." Margaret glanced toward Gideon. "He's a good man." "Yes, he is. He's never looked twice at a woman in this town in all the years he's been here. And then you arrive and suddenly—" She spread her hands slightly. "And suddenly what?" Lena asked. She kept her voice genuinely curious rather than sharp, because she'd learned that sharp made people feel attacked, and attack made people dig in, and she wasn't sure she wanted this to be a fight. "What do you think I've done?" "I think you've been attentive in a way that's difficult for a man to—" "Margaret," Ruth Prentice materialized on Lena's other side as promised. "What are you saying exactly?" Margaret startled slightly. I heard what you were just. I've been hearing it for 3 months." Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman who is not angry, but has made a decision. "Lena has worked hard, dealt with everyone in this town fairly, and done nothing to deserve being talked about the way she's been talked about. I know you mean well, but meaning well is not the same as being right, and I think it would be good for this community if you let the subject rest." It was said quietly, firmly, without cruelty and without apology. Margaret Holt opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at Lena, and then at Ruth, and then at some point in the middle distance, recalibrating. "I do mean well," she said after a moment. Her voice was slightly different, less certain. "I believe you," Lena said. And she did, which was the complicated part. Margaret Holt was not a villain. She was a woman who'd built an opinion in the absence of real information and had held it with the stubbornness people use to avoid admitting they were wrong. Lena had done the same thing about other people at other times in her life. "I'm not asking you to like me," she continued. "I'm just asking you to let what you've seen over the last few months weigh as much as what you decided when I arrived." Margaret was quiet. Then she said stiffly, "You make good soup." It was not an apology, but it was something. "Thank you," Lena said. Margaret moved away. Ruth watched her go and then turned to Lena with an expression that was neither triumph nor quite amusement, but something in between. "She'll be different after tonight," she said. "Not transformed, but different." "That's enough," Lena said, and meant it. The music started again. The fiddle player was someone's uncle visiting from the next town, and he played with the loose fluency of a man who'd been doing it for 40 years and had stopped thinking about it, which meant the music moved like water rather than something being constructed. People drifted toward the center of the room where the tables had been pushed back. Gideon appeared beside her. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Better than I expected. I heard Ruth Prentice had words with Margaret Holt." "Small rooms," she said. "Small town," he corrected. She watched the couples forming in the center of the room, the Calloways among them, Clara moving with a surprising lightness that her daytime practicality didn't suggest, Hal keeping careful time beside her with the expression of a man who has learned the steps under duress and is mildly proud of having done so. "Do you dance?" Gideon asked. She looked at him. "I haven't in years." "That's not what I asked." "I know the basic steps. I'm not going to embarrass myself." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, that open, unhurried hand, The same one that had carried her water bucket on the first morning and caught her fingers in the cold outside a burning barn. The same patient certainty in the gesture. She took it. They moved to the center of the room, where there were other couples, where it was not singular or dramatic, where they were simply two more people among the others, except that she understood from the way the room's ambient attention redistributed slightly as they moved that it was not nothing, that Iron Creek was watching, that this was being filed away in the collective ledger the town kept on all its members. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared. She was not indifferent, but the caring had changed texture. It wasn't the grinding anxiety of her first weeks, the way she'd measured every look and held herself apart and wondered if she was making things worse by existing somewhere she hadn't been invited. It was just the ordinary awareness of someone participating in public life, which was normal, which was what people did. The music was a waltz, or something near enough to a waltz for a frontier hall with a single fiddle. Gideon held her correctly, one hand at her waist, one hand holding hers, and she put her free hand on his shoulder, and they found the rhythm together in the first 8 counts, which were slightly awkward, and then they didn't have to think about it anymore. He danced the way she had expected him to, not gracefully, not with any particular flair, but correctly and solidly, paying attention. He didn't talk while they moved. She didn't either. The music did what music does in a room full of people on a winter evening. It made everything slightly less complicated. She was aware of how close they were. She was aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist. She was aware, in a way she'd been carefully not being aware for 3 months, that she had come to trust this person, not in the cautious, conditional way she trusted most people, but in the simpler way that comes from watching someone be consistently themselves over a long period and finding that the self they were was one you could lean on without it moving. She had not expected this. She had come to Iron Creek to make a practical arrangement with a man she'd never met, and that man was in the ground, and the arrangement was nothing. And what she'd found instead was more complicated and slower and considerably more frightening than any arrangement would have been, because arrangements had clearly defined terms, and this did not. "You're thinking very hard," Gideon said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "I know. What about tonight?" She looked up at him. They were close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw that she'd noticed months ago and never asked about and still hadn't. "Mostly about how I didn't expect to still be here," she said, "in Iron Creek. When I arrived, I thought I'd be gone by the end of the first week. And I'm still here, dancing at the December social." She paused. "With you. Is that a surprise?" "Yes," she said. "Honestly, it is." He considered that for a moment. Around them the room moved and the fiddle played and the lamps were warm against the December cold outside the windows. "Good surprise or bad surprise?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. This man who'd told her about green wood and hot stoves and carried her water bucket and gone through a burning window and said, "I'm done watching it be wrong in a room full of people who expected him to stay quiet." "Good," she said. "Definitively good." Something changed in his face. It was small. A fractional easing, like a door that has been shut for a long time, shifting just slightly on its hinges. She'd said something that mattered, and he'd received it, and she could see it in him, that quiet register of a thing finally being said that needed to be said. The song ended. Another began almost immediately, the fiddle player not inclined toward long pauses. They stayed on the floor. She didn't suggest leaving, and he didn't either. They danced 2 more times before the evening moved into its final stage. The slow dispersal of families with children heading home first, then the older couples, then the remaining groups breaking into conversations that would conclude eventually in coats being retrieved and goodnights exchanged. The night was cold and sharp outside. Her breath made clouds. His did too. They walked back toward her room above the land office, through the empty December street, footsteps loud on the frozen ground, the stars very bright and very high overhead. At the bottom of the stairs, she turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for asking me." He looked at her with the expression she knew now, that attending stillness. "How was it? The room? Better than I thought it would be?" She considered. "Ruth Prentice stood next to me when I needed someone to stand next to me. Hal Calloway shook my hand. Margaret Holt told me I make good soup. That's progress." That is progress. She looked up at him. You knew it would go like this. I hoped, he said. I didn't know. You seem very certain most of the time. I'm not, he said simply. I'm just slow to show the uncertainty. Different thing. This was the most personal thing he'd said to her about himself, she thought, in all the weeks she'd known him. She filed it carefully. Gideon, she said. Yes. I've been careful about this all these months because I came here on a bad plan, and the plan collapsed, and I was in a strange place with no money and nowhere to go, and I was afraid that what I might feel towards someone who helped me was gratitude dressed up as something else. He watched her steadily. I've been trying to tell the difference, she said, for months, between the gratitude and the other thing. And? She looked at him. The cold air, the quiet street, the stars. They're both real, she said. The gratitude is real, and the other thing is also real, and they're not the same thing. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Lena. Yes. I've been waiting for you to figure that out for 3 months. I know, she said. I'm sorry it took that long. Don't be. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face. A gesture so simple and unhurried that she stood completely still for it, the way you stand still for something you didn't know you needed until it happened. It took as long as it took. You're a careful woman. I told you I didn't need you to be less careful. She caught his hand before he could take it away, held it against her face for just a moment, then let it go. Good night, Gideon, she said. Good night, Lena. She went up the stairs. At the top, she looked back once. He was still standing at the bottom, his hat in his hand, looking up at her. She went inside. She stood in the middle of her small room, the east window dark now, the needle case on the sill, the rug she'd bought for almost nothing, the blanket folded on the cot. And she stood there in her blue dress with her mother's hairpins, and she let herself feel all of it at once, without managing it, without the careful distance she'd maintained for so long. It was a great deal to feel. She let it be that. Outside Iron Creek was quiet in the December cold. She could hear nothing through the sealed window except the faint sound of the wind. She was still here, against every expectation she'd had when she stepped off that stagecoach in September with 41 cents and a dead man's letter and nowhere to go. She was still here, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she was glad of it. The proposal happened on a Tuesday. She would think about that later, the specific day of the week, because Tuesday was the day she'd arrived in Iron Creek on a stagecoach with 41 cents and a dead man's letter. And there was something in the symmetry of it that felt less like coincidence and more like the kind of quiet joke that life occasionally makes at your expense. Except this time the joke landed differently. This time Tuesday was not the day everything collapsed. It was the day something finished being built. It was mid-January. The cold had settled into the valley with the permanence of a winter that intended to stay. The kind of cold that doesn't fluctuate much between day and night, but simply maintains itself. A steady gray pressure that makes the ground iron hard and turns breath to vapor and strips the world to its essential shapes. Bare trees, pale sky, the dark line of the ridge above the valley. She'd been in Iron Creek for just under 5 months. She was at the pump when he came. Not symbolic, just practical, because she always went to the pump in the morning and he'd learned her schedule the way people learn the schedules of people they pay attention to. He came on foot, not horseback, which was unusual enough that she noticed it and looked at him a second time as he crossed the road. He was carrying something. She couldn't tell what until he was closer. A small folded piece of paper, held with the care of something he didn't want to crumple. Morning, she said. Morning. He stopped. He looked at the paper in his hand rather than at her, which was the most uncertain she'd ever seen him look, and she'd spent 5 months cataloging his expressions. I had something I wanted to say to you, and I wrote it down because I thought I might get it wrong if I didn't. She set down the bucket. All right. He unfolded the paper. He looked at it for a moment and then back at her. I'm not going to read it to you, he said. That seems wrong. But I needed to write it to know what I meant to say. What did you mean to say? He put the paper in his coat pocket. The wind moved between them, cold and thin. I want to marry you, he said. Not because you need an arrangement, not because of what happened when you got here or what people said, or any of that. I want to marry you because you are the most capable and honest and genuinely difficult person I have met in my adult life. And I would like to spend a considerable amount of time arguing with you about practical things and watching you figure out problems I haven't thought of yet and sitting next to you at tables." He paused. "That's mostly what the paper said, more or less." She looked at him standing in the January morning, his coat dark against the pale sky, the folded paper in his pocket. "You think I'm difficult," she said. "Considerably. That's in a marriage proposal." I said what was true. She picked up her bucket. She looked at the water in it for a moment. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. He absorbed this. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'm difficult. Both things." She held the bucket with both hands. "You should know that I have opinions about how a property should be run, and I don't always defer when I think I'm right. And I've been saving money since I got here, and I intend to buy that parcel on the South Ridge." "I know about the South Ridge parcel. You told me in October. And I haven't changed my mind." "I know that too." The near smile. The one that almost arrived and then stayed just behind his expression, like light behind a curtain. "We could look at it together, if you want." She considered him. This man who'd told her about green wood and stoves and carried her water bucket and gone through a burning barn and said, "I'm done watching it be wrong," in a room full of witnesses, and had apparently spent the last several weeks writing down what he wanted to say to her because he was afraid of getting it wrong. This imperfect, honest, infuriating, steadfast man. "Yes," she said again. "We could do that." They told Clara Calloway first, because telling Clara first was both practical and correct. Clara received the news by putting down the fabric she was holding, looking at Lena for 3 full seconds with those sharp eyes, and then saying, "Good," with the compression of a woman who has decided not to make a moment bigger than it needs to be, which was, Lena had come to understand, the highest form of Clara's approval. Hal shook Gideon's hand, then he shook it again. Then he went to find something in another room for a few minutes, and came back with the carefully neutral face of a man who'd needed a moment to himself. The news moved through Iron Creek, the way news always moved through Iron Creek. Before either of them had intended it to be generally known, it was generally known. She was cooking the midday meal at Dolan's kitchen on Thursday when a woman she barely recognized came in and shook her hand and said she'd heard the news and wished her well. And Lena stood there holding a dish towel and said thank you, and tried to calibrate what exactly was happening to the social atmosphere of the town. What was happening, she would gradually understand, was something more complicated than acceptance. It wasn't that Iron Creek had decided Lena Ashcroft was who they'd misjudged her to be, and was making collective amends. Towns didn't work that cleanly, and people didn't either. What happened was more gradual and more honest than that. The people who'd always been decent, Clara and Hal, Ruth Prentice, even Dolan, in his blunt way, simply continued being decent, and the people who'd been unkind either quietly recalibrated or continued being unkind, and the balance shifted slowly in one direction because one side was putting in the work and the other side was running out of material. Margaret Holt did not come to shake her hand, but she stopped actively contributing to the narrative, which was its own form of progress. Vernon Hatch, who had stood in the Calloway doorway on the night of the fire and asked, "What's she doing here?" came into the saloon 2 weeks after the engagement was known and sat at the table Lena served and ordered his meal and said, when she set it down, "I hear congratulations are in order." "They are," she said. He nodded. He ate his meal. When he left, he said the soup was good. She went back to the kitchen and told herself that was enough, because it was. You didn't get to decide how people apologized. You only got to decide whether you accepted the form that was offered. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter had passed, and the ground was soft enough that you could believe things would grow in it again. The ceremony was at the town hall. Not a large affair, not a production, but not private either. The Calloways stood up with them. Ruth Prentice came. Dolan came, which surprised her, and sat in the back row with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was attending something against his general principles but had decided to make an exception. About 30 people came. 6 months ago, she hadn't known any of them. She wore the blue dress. She'd let the hem out and replace the cuffs, which had finally given up pretending they weren't worn, and Ruth had given her a length of cream ribbon to work into the collar, so it looked different enough from the Friday social that it felt like its own thing. She'd kept her mother's hairpins. Gideon wore his good coat, which she'd mended twice now, and knew the inside of better than he probably did. He was early, which did not surprise her, standing near the front of the room with Hal when she came in. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly and with that attending stillness. And then he said quietly, just to her, "You look good." "You already said that, Friday social, December." "It's still true." They stood in front of the justice of the peace, who was a practical man named Aldridge, with ink-stained cuffs and reading glasses that sat low on his nose. He read the words that needed to be said. They said the words that needed to be said back. She meant all of them, which she hadn't expected to be so certain about, and was. When it was done, Clara reached over from the front row and squeezed her hand once, firm and brief, and let go. That was what she would remember most clearly from the ceremony. Not the words, not the room, but Clara Calloway's hand on hers for 3 seconds and then gone, like a period at the end of a sentence. Chicum. The parcel on the South Ridge was purchased in April, which was when the land office confirmed the price the owner, a man in Dalhart who'd inherited it and never intended to do anything with it, was willing to accept. She paid a portion from her savings. Gideon put in the rest. They stood together at the land office desk and signed the deed, and she looked at their names on the paper and felt something she didn't have a word for, that was somewhere between terrified and completely certain. The land was not impressive by the standards of the established ranches in the valley. It was rocky in places, with a slope on the north side that would make winter difficult, and the natural water source was a seasonal creek that ran reliably in spring and needed a proper well dug before they could depend on it year-round. The grass in the lower field was good. The soil in the flatter section was reasonable. It was, by any objective assessment, a project. Gideon stood on the ridge the first afternoon they walked it together, looking out over the valley below, and said, "It's going to take work." "Everything worth having takes work," she said. "You knew that when you agreed to look at it with me." "I did." He crouched down and picked up a handful of soil and turned it in his hand. "Good dirt in the flat section." "I thought so too." He let the dirt fall. "Spring planting season starts in 6 weeks." "I know. We'd need to be in a structure by fall, even a rough one." "I know that too." She looked at the land. Her land, their land, this difficult, rocky, challenging, possible piece of the frontier that she'd been saving for since October. "Are you telling me it can be done or telling me it can't?" "I'm telling you what the timeline looks like." "And?" He stood up and looked at her. "And I think we can do it. I just want us both to be clear on what we're agreeing to." She looked back at him. "Gideon, I came 1,000 miles on a stagecoach to marry a man I'd never met. I arrived to find him dead. I spent 3 months sleeping in a storeroom and cooking in a saloon kitchen and waiting for a town to decide whether I was worth speaking to." She turned back to the land. "I'm clear on what I'm agreeing to." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's fair." "Yes," she said, "it is." They walked the property until the light started going, measuring distances and strides, arguing about where the well should be positioned relative to where they intended to put the structure. She wanted it closer to the house site. He thought closer to the lower field was more practical for a working property. They went back and forth on it twice, and she conceded the second time because his reasoning was better, which she told him plainly, and he received her concession the way he always received things she gave him, without fanfare, just a nod that meant he'd heard. This was what marriage with Gideon Mercer was actually like. She was learning. Not a thing of grand gestures and transformed hearts, but a daily negotiation between two people with strong opinions and a shared direction. He was right sometimes. She was right sometimes. They argued civilly about fences and soil and how much seed to order and whether the north slope was workable in year 1 or needed to wait. He cooked badly, and she knew it and made no effort to spare his feelings about it, which he seemed to appreciate in his usual undramatic way. She was slow to wake in the mornings, and he was not, and he learned to start the coffee and leave it, which was perhaps the most practical form of consideration she'd ever received from another person. They built a life the way all honest lives get built, not by inspiration or luck or the grace of things falling into place, but by the repetitive daily decision to do the next thing and the thing after that, and to keep doing it when it was hard, which it frequently was. The structure went up in late summer. A small house, 2 rooms, built with help from Hal Calloway, and 2 of his ranch hands over 3 long weekends, with Gideon doing the bulk of the interior framing himself. She worked alongside them, which startled the ranch hands the first day and didn't by the third. She learned to set a beam level from Hal, who showed her twice with the patience of a man who'd taught his own children to do things and had the calm for it. She learned that she was bad at roofing and that this was a limitation she needed to accept and assign to someone better at it, which was the ranch hand named Pruitt, who turned out to be extraordinarily competent at roofing and took a visible quiet pride in the fact that she noticed. The house was finished in September. It was small and the floors were uneven in one corner, and the window on the east side didn't quite seal against wind. She stuffed the gap with cloth in the same way she'd sealed the windows in her rented room the first winter, and thought about how some problems just followed you around, and you got better at solving them rather than stopping encountering them. She stood in the kitchen of her own house on the first night they slept there and looked at the walls around her, real walls, a roof she'd helped build, land outside that had her name on the deed. Gideon came in from outside, brushing dust from his coat. He looked at her standing in the middle of the kitchen. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He looked around the kitchen too, trying to see what she was seeing. "It's not finished." "I know." "The corner floor, so I know about the corner floor. I'm not looking at the floor." She turned to him. "I'm looking at the walls." He considered this and then apparently decided it made sense. "Good walls," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good walls." The following spring, the first crop went in. Oats and winter wheat in the flat lower field, a kitchen garden closer to the house with vegetables she'd mapped on paper over the winter. The well was dug in February by a man from the next valley who did nothing but wells and did them well. And the water came up clean and cold, and she stood at the edge of the new well in the February cold and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved in a way that would hold. She was still taking mending from Clara Calloway, less now, by choice, because the ranch demanded enough of her time that she'd had to reduce the outside work. But she kept the contract because Clara was Clara, and the relationship had become something she valued beyond its practical terms. She'd learned to see Clara clearly by now, not as a patron or a benefactor, but as a woman who'd built something real and recognized the same effort in others, and responded to it with a directness that looked like coldness from outside and felt like respect from inside. On a Thursday afternoon in that second spring, sitting in the Calloway kitchen with the mending between them and coffee going cold on the table, Clara said, "Do you know what people call you now?" Lena looked up. "Do I want to?" "Probably." Clara turned a shirt collar without looking up. "They call you the woman who came to nothing and built something, various versions of that. That's a long name. It shortens." Clara set the collar down and looked at her. "Ruth Prentice told me last week that she sends people to you when they need someone who knows how to work. Not for mending, just in general. Someone who knows how to work." Lena held this for a moment. "Margaret Holt." Clara's expression flickered. "Margaret Holt told Edna Price that you have backbone. She didn't say it kindly, exactly, but she said it. Coming from Margaret Holt, the distinction between kindly and not kindly mattered less than the content." "That's something," Lena said. "That's a great deal, from her." Clara picked the collar back up. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel good about yourself. You have enough sense not to need that." "Why are you telling me then?" Clara looked at her directly. "Because when you arrived here, this town treated you like nothing, and I want you to know that I watched how you handled that, and that it was not easy, what you did. Staying, working, not letting them make you small." She paused, and Clara Calloway was not a woman who paused. "I've known a lot of women who would have left. You should know you didn't have to stay. But you did." Lena looked at the kitchen around her. This kitchen she'd been in dozens of times now, that felt as familiar as her own. She thought about what to say. "I stayed because I was out of money," she said. "That was the first reason." "I know. And then I stayed because a man told me about green wood and hot stoves without wanting anything in return. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I know that too. And then I stayed because leaving would have meant they were right about me. She looked at Clara. I'm not sure that's admirable. It might just be stubbornness. Most admirable things are stubbornness in a good direction, Clara said. That's all courage is, really. Stubbornness that's aimed right. She thought about that for a while afterward, on the ride back to the South Ridge. Stubbornness aimed right. She'd spent most of her life being stubborn in small ways, stubborn about keeping her cuffs mended, stubborn about not asking for help she didn't need, stubborn about not letting people see her when she was uncertain. All of that was stubbornness aimed inward, aimed at survival, aimed at not being visible in the wrong ways. What she'd done in Iron Creek was different. She'd been stubborn outward, stubborn toward something rather than away from it. She'd stayed when leaving was available. She'd let someone carry her water bucket. She told a man who asked about her plans that she wanted to buy land before the idea was anything more than a thought. She'd put on her blue dress and walked through the door of the December social and let the room see her plainly. She didn't know how to make that into a lesson. She didn't think it was a lesson, exactly. It was just what she'd done, choice by ordinary choice, each one small, none of them guaranteed to work out. That was the thing nobody told you about building a life. It didn't happen in a single decision. It happened in the accumulated weight of small ones. The Tuesday you chose to stay, the Wednesday you accepted a cup of coffee from someone who meant it, the October afternoon you said out loud that you wanted something and let another person hear you. By the second full year on the South Ridge, the property had changed. Not dramatically. She would have distrusted dramatic change, would have thought something was being performed for an audience. But solidly, the way land changes when people are actually working it. The lower field under proper rotation now. The kitchen garden producing beyond what they could use themselves. The house with a second room added in the summer that was more careful work than the first because they knew more by then. A second horse in the small barn. A good one. A bay that reminded her of the horse Gideon rode when she'd first seen him. She kept records. She'd started the habit in the first month when the numbers were small and mostly theoretical, and continued it because she found that understanding where she stood at any given moment made her less anxious about where she was going. Gideon didn't keep records the way she did. He kept them in his head, which worked for him. But she needed to see the numbers on paper. This was one of the differences between them that they'd negotiated without calling it a negotiation. She kept the ledgers and he reviewed them when she asked, and offered corrections when he had them and otherwise trusted her to do it correctly, which she did. The ledger at the end of the second year showed a property that was not profitable yet, but was moving in the right direction, with a trajectory she could explain and defend and project forward. She showed it to Gideon on a December evening, 1 year after the Friday social, nearly, and he sat at the kitchen table and read through it with the same attention he gave everything. We're not in trouble, he said. No. We're not comfortable yet. No, she agreed. But look at the line between year 1 and year 2. He looked at it. That's the oat yield. And the mending income tapering down as the property income goes up. The substitution is working. She sat across from him at the table. Third year, if the wheat comes in, we'll be close to even. Fourth year should be the first year we actually have something left over. He looked at the numbers for another moment. You've thought about this. I think about everything. I know. He looked up at her. Something in his face was doing the thing she'd come to know. That quiet registering of something he wanted to say, and was calibrating how to say it. You've built this, he said. I want you to know I see that. We built it, she said. Most of the plan was yours. Most of the labor was yours. He shook his head slightly. That's not... Lena, I'm trying to tell you something. She looked at him. Tell me then. When you arrived here, he said, you had nothing, and you didn't collapse inward. Some people do. When everything goes wrong at once and they're alone and the place they've landed doesn't want them, some people shrink down into themselves and don't come back out. He looked at the ledger and then at her. You didn't do that. You got smaller for about 2 weeks, and then you started getting bigger, and you didn't stop. He paused. I just want you to know that I watched that happen, and I thought it was remarkable, even before I had any other reason to think about you. She was quiet for a moment. She was not by nature a woman who received compliments gracefully. She'd spent too many years in circumstances where compliments were either absent or came with conditions, and she'd built a kind of deflecting reflex that activated whenever someone said something kind and direct. She was aware of the reflex. She managed it unevenly. "You carried my water bucket," she said finally. "The first morning, before you knew anything about me." "Yes."
"Why?" "Actually, you gave me a reason at the time, but it was a practical reason." He thought about this. "Because you looked like you were doing the next thing," he said. "Whatever the next thing was, you were doing it, not thinking about what came before it or whether it was what you'd planned. Just the next thing." He looked at her steadily. "I find that hard to resist in a person." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I find it hard to resist in one too," she said.
He almost smiled. He almost always almost smiled. The third year, the wheat came in well. Not perfectly. A late frost took some of the east section, and she'd overestimated the yield by about 15%, which she noted in the ledger with the particular annotation style she used for her own errors, slightly more precise than the notations for things outside her control, because she believed in holding herself to a different standard than she held circumstances. But the yield was good enough, and the oats were strong, and by the end of the third autumn, the property was doing what she'd said it would do when she'd stood on the south ridge with a folded deed and explained the numbers to a man who listened to numbers carefully. They were close to even. Not comfortable. Close. She still cooked Thursday mornings at Dolan's kitchen, though she'd reduced the days. She did it partly for the income, which still helped, and partly because the kitchen had been her first place in Iron Creek, and she felt a loyalty to it that she couldn't entirely explain in practical terms. Dolan had never asked her why she kept coming when she didn't need to. She didn't volunteer the explanation. They had an understanding that didn't require articulation, which was the kind of relationship she'd found was often the most durable. She was finishing the Thursday service one morning in the autumn of the third year when a young woman came in the back door of the saloon kitchen, not the front, the back, and stood in the doorway with a suitcase that was obviously heavy and an expression that Lena recognized in the way you recognize something you've worn yourself. The woman was maybe 23. She had the look of someone who'd been traveling for days and had been trying to hold herself together and was now, in this kitchen doorway, slightly at the end of what she'd had available to hold herself with. "I'm sorry to come in the back," she said. "I didn't want to—" She stopped. "There was a man, a rancher. I came to meet him. He was—" "Sit down," Lena said. The woman looked at her. "Sit," Lena said again. She pulled a chair out from the small table at the side of the kitchen. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning." Lena went to the stove and found what was left of the morning's soup and ladled some into a bowl. She set it in front of the woman and watched her try not to eat it too fast. She sat across from her and waited. The story came out in pieces, the way these things did. The man had been older than his letters suggested. His property was not what he'd described. He'd met her at the stage with a face that made it immediately clear to both of them that the arrangement was not going to work, and he'd said so plainly, and she'd had nowhere to go. She'd come to the saloon because the stage driver had said it was the first place in town. Lena listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She thought about 41 cents and a dead man's letter and a pump in the early morning. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ellen Marsh." "I'm Lena Mercer." She held out her hand and the woman shook it. "I want to tell you something, Ellen, and I want you to hear it directly. The way this is starting is not the way it has to end. I know that's not a useful thing to hear when you're sitting in a stranger's kitchen with a heavy suitcase and nowhere to go, but I'm telling you because it's true, and because someone should say it to you before the town decides what to say instead." Ellen looked at her. Her eyes were red from the road and something else. "Do you know somewhere I can sleep tonight? I can pay a little." "You can sleep at my property," Lena said. "For now. We have room." She stood up. "Finish the soup. Then we'll figure out the rest." She went to the door between the kitchen and the bar and found Dolan wiping glasses with his usual expression of resigned functionality. "I need to leave an hour early today," she said. He looked past her at the woman at the kitchen table. He looked back at Lena with the expression of a man who understood the situation and was deciding not to editorialize on it. "Fine," he said. She went back to the kitchen. Ellen Marsh stayed 2 weeks on the South Ridge, which extended to a month, which extended to a winter.
She was from Ohio, and she knew horses, and she worked hard in the way of someone who'd learned that work was the thing you had when other things fell away. Gideon taught her the fencing work in the first month without making it a lesson, which was his way. He'd show something once, twice if needed, and then move on with the assumption that the person had absorbed it,
which created a kind of expectation that people usually met. Ellen met it. She was good with the horses and useful in a dozen ways they hadn't specifically needed until she arrived and made them visible. In the spring, she got a position at the Prentice property, which Ruth had offered after running into her twice in town and asking, with characteristic directness, whether she was looking for steady work. She was. She took it. She came back to the South Ridge for Sunday meals through the following year, which had been nobody's explicit plan and became a habit without ceremony. The Callaways came too sometimes. Ruth. Once or twice, Dolan, who ate with the same economy he brought to everything and said the food was fine, which she took as the compliment it was. The table got crowded, and the house felt the way a house feels when it's being used for what a house is actually for. She would not say that Iron Creek had transformed. Towns didn't transform. They shifted, incrementally, the way all living things shift, accumulating small changes that over time amounted to something different than what they'd been. The people who'd been kind to her were still kind. The people who'd been unkind had mostly become neutral, which was as much as she asked. Margaret Holt had said once to a newcomer at the general store, Lena had overheard it, "That's Lena Mercer. She's been here a few years now. She runs the South Ridge property with her husband. Good woman." Malpo said in the tone of someone who'd arrived at a conclusion through reasonable evidence and was stating it as fact. She had not said she came as a mail-order bride or the man she was meant to marry died before she arrived. She had said, "Good woman, South Ridge, her husband." It was not reconciliation. It was just Margaret Holt catching up with reality at her own speed. Lena decided to accept it for what it was. The evening she thought about most, in the years that followed, was not the wedding, or the signing of the deed, or the first night in the house with good walls. It was an ordinary evening in the autumn of the 4th year, after the harvest was in and the ledger was showing the first actual surplus. Not large, not enough to be comfortable about, but real. A real number in the right column that she could point to and say, this is what the work added up to. She was sitting on the step of the house in the last of the afternoon light. The valley spread below the South Ridge in its autumn colors, the air sharp and still. Gideon was in the barn doing something with the harness that needed doing. She could hear the occasional sound of him working, the particular rhythm of a person moving through familiar tasks. She had a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She was not thinking about anything specific. She was just sitting. This was the thing she'd never had in all the years before Iron Creek, a place to simply sit, a step that was hers, a view that was hers, a set of sounds she recognized as belonging to the life she'd built. She'd spent so long moving through spaces that didn't belong to her. The landlady's house in Cincinnati, Dolan's storeroom, the rented room above the land office, that she'd stopped expecting to have a place to simply be. She thought that was a reasonable adjustment to her circumstances. She thought you let go of certain expectations when certain things failed to happen, and you got smaller around the edges in practical ways, and that was how you survived. She'd been wrong about that, or partly wrong. Survival was necessary, and she didn't underestimate it. But the space between surviving and actually having something, that space was not fixed. It was not sealed off by bad luck or wrong circumstances or the particular way a town looked at you when you arrived. It was traversable. The traversal was hard and not guaranteed, and she'd been lucky in ways she didn't minimize. She'd been lucky that Gideon Mercer had been the kind of man he was, lucky that Clara Calloway existed. Lucky that the timing of a dozen small things had worked out rather than against her. But she'd also made choices. She'd stayed on a Tuesday when leaving was technically available. She'd handed over a water bucket on a cold morning. She'd said out loud that she wanted land before the money was there to buy it. She'd put on a blue dress and walked through a door and let a room see her clearly. None of these things had been guaranteed. All of them had cost something, some small expenditure of courage or stubbornness, or whatever the right word was for the thing that made a person keep going when stopping was an option. You didn't get to know, she thought, when you were in the middle of it, which small choices would matter. You couldn't see the accumulation from inside it.
You just made the choices you could live with and kept working and tried to tell the difference between gratitude and love and hope and fear. And sometimes you got it right and sometimes you got it wrong, and the getting it wrong didn't undo the getting it right. She heard Gideon come out of the barn. He crossed the yard and came and sat on the step beside her without being invited and without asking, the way he'd been doing since their first winter in the house, and she moved over slightly to give him room. He looked out at the valley. She looked at the valley. The light was going golden and then amber, and the shadows were long on the grass. "Ledger's good," he said. "Yes." "First year in the black." "Yes." She looked at the numbers in her head, which she always carried. "Next year should be better if the south field holds." "It'll hold." He said it with the particular certainty of a man who'd been watching that soil for 3 years. The drainage fixed it. She'd been the one who'd identified the drainage issue. He'd been the one who'd fixed it. This was often how it went. She saw the problem, he solved it, she recorded the outcome. They argued about what to do next. It was not a romantic division of labor. It was a functional one, which was better. "We should think about a second horse next year," she said, "if the surplus holds." "I've been thinking the same thing. Something younger than the bay." "Yes." She leaned back slightly on her hands and felt the step beneath her, solid and slightly rough. 4 years ago, she'd arrived in this territory with 41 cents and the careful penmanship of a dead man in her pocket. She'd slept in a storeroom and cooked in a borrowed kitchen and counted the coins in her savings tin every night by candlelight, like a woman counting the distance to something she couldn't quite see yet. Here was the distance. This step. This valley. This man sitting beside her whose shoulder was against hers in the cooling air. She thought about Ellen Marsh, who was over at the Prentice property now, learning the horses and getting her footing in this place that hadn't asked her to come and hadn't made it easy when she arrived. She thought about the woman she'd been at the pump in her first week, moving fast enough that the 2 women on the millinery porch wouldn't realize she'd heard them. She thought about what it meant, all of it, the whole long arc of the last 4 years. And she didn't have a clean answer, because life didn't produce clean answers. What she had was a south ridge and a good ledger and a man who'd written down what he wanted to say to her so he wouldn't get it wrong, and a table that got crowded on Sundays, and a young woman she'd fed soup in a saloon kitchen who was now feeding herself. What she had was a place, a life that fit her. Not perfectly. She didn't trust perfect, but well. Honestly. Hers. Belonging, she had learned, was not something a place gave you. It was not a thing that existed in the air of a town, waiting to settle on the right people. It was something you built, one ordinary choice at a time, in the direction of the life you actually wanted rather than the life that was simply available. It was stubbornness aimed right. That was all. That was everything. She finished her cold coffee. Gideon didn't say anything. The valley below went from amber to gray in the long autumn dusk, and the first stars came out over the ridge, and somewhere behind them the house stood with its uneven corner floor and its east window and its good walls, waiting for them to come back inside. She sat on her step, in her life, and let it be enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what she'd crossed 1,000 miles to find, and nothing at all like what she'd expected, and hers all the same.